trans rights, the latest frontier in the battle for civil liberties. And this latest movement has some unique hurdles. First, think how many people actually identify as trans. According to the super reliable, never wrong Google AI, only 1.5 million, or 0.5% of the US population identify as trans. And even if every one of them is equally distributed across the 50 states, that's only like 30,000 per state. This small population not only makes it weak politically, but a vulnerable target. First, think how much force it takes to move the status quo. It's not the status, yeah, let's see what could be better. No, groups have to go out and make themselves seen and heard. That's what previous groups did. But the bigger the group, the louder it is. Half the population has two X chromosomes, so therefore, their issues get taken more seriously. But most marginalized groups aren't made up of 50% of the population. In those cases, groups leverage support from so-called normal people to help have their voices heard. But when your town has more subways than trans folk, it's hard to build that support. Compared to the number of homosexuals in the US who make up about 5% of the population, while still not a large number, 1 out of 20 people is enough for the normies to make a personal connection. Because their friends, neighbors, and coworkers are gay, the average person feels like they have a stake in this fight. And people feel like this fight is personal because they feel empathy. Without empathy, people won't care. And for most marginalized groups, feeling some sort of empathy is easy. I can imagine how upsetting not having agency over your own body can be. I've been judged by the way I look, and it sucks. And love is obviously love. But what do transgender people feel? Gender dysmorphia is hard to explain. It's not something a cis person typically feels, and that is a huge issue. Without a shared experience, there's going to be an empathy gap. And where there's an empathy gap, there's apathy. And when bullies sense apathy, they pounce. And let's be real, people love to hate. It's way easier to get a group of people to hate someone than it is to actually solve problems. And when it comes to the transgendered, the ratio of hate to allies is too damn high. So then, the status quo can keep them down. And just who are the status quo? In this case, it's politicians, grifters, bad science, and parents. And I find the bad science and concerned parents the most interesting. Bad science because not only is it a reoccurring yet under-discussed negative voice, it's also a voice that carries so much weight. History is full of people using science to justify their bigoted views. From doctors using the head circumference of Africans to prove they're savages, to gay conversion therapies dating all the way back before Sigmund Freud. Each generation has people who are gonna amplify bogus science to further their agenda. So even with a lack of causation, wild conclusions are drawn to uphold the status quo. Even now, there's websites that dramatize the side effects of puberty blockers and hormone treatments, despite the lack of research. And this bad faith science has been around for so long because it's so effective. Regardless of the time period, the title of doctor means something. The public puts their trust in doctors, and the opinions of trusted individuals matter when it comes to social issues. And then there's parents. And if science is seen as purely evidence-based, parents are all emotion. Their fight against the trans agenda is unique due to their primary motivation: protecting their kids. Just from an evolutionary standpoint, parents have been protecting their kids against threats for thousands of years. Now, back in the caveman times, those fears were justified. Around every corner there was something there looking to eat you. But now, those threats have largely vanished, but the programming runs as normal. This basic instinct is what led previous crusades against rock and roll, Dungeons and Dragons, SpongeBob, and to be fair, SpongeBob did turn a lot of kids gay. The point is, parents overblowing the new is a tale as old as time. But now, that fear is being exploited like never before thanks to the large reach grifters have. One of the most dangerous aspects of the internet is how rampant fear-mongering and hate is. You see it on YouTube, Instagram, TikTok. Hate gets clicks, which is terrifying. Because when I look back on my past, a lot of what I learned from what I watched. And I'm by no means proud of that, no. But during my childhood, Kids shows taught ideas like tolerance, community, and sure, SpongeBob turned me a little gay, but you take the good with the bad. That's because the people who used to make entertainment for both kids and adults were, for the most part, pretty educated and progressive. And because there used to be a finite amount of airspace in the pre-streaming days, the majority of Americans got exposed to progressive ideas through TV shows and movies. But now, pop culture has been replaced by niche content. Everyone watches their own personalized content opposed to the 70s, 80s, and 90s. In the past, when Archie Bunker shoved a mirror in front of America's face, they had to look, but not today. People who want progressive ideas will be shown progressive ideas. People looking for hate will get hate. But because hate is such an engaging emotion, people are often served hate without even searching for it. Now, while these entertainment microcosms create spaces for trans individuals to tell their stories, the individualization of media ultimately hurts the transgendered more than it helps them. And it all goes back to those numbers and how hate garners engagement. How many channels are there focusing solely on trans rights and positive trans stories? I'm sure they're out there, but it's dwarfed compared to the amount of channels that are just looking to stir shit up. I mean, you see a video claiming that schools are installing litter boxes for trans species students? I don't care who you are, that video is getting clicks. In the past, Hollywood could cram its liberal agenda down America's throats. Sure, the history of the entertainment industry is mired in sexism and racism, but in general it ticks towards progress. But now there's these sophisticated production companies that not only thrive off hate, but also don't have to adhere to any strict regulations the way TV stations do. Now, I'm not saying we should go back to a time when a handful of companies gatekeeped mass media. It's just interesting to see the unattended consequences of giving everyone a microphone. But what's even more interesting is how the pro-trans group and anti-trans groups actually have something in common: a desire to protect children. There's people out there who believe that there's teens and young adults that truly know they're trans, so those people ought to be supported. That gender-affirming care is healthcare. But there's others that see pro-trans sentiment as propaganda meant to influence their children. That the trans agenda is infecting kids. So when Matt Walsh takes this hardline stance on the trans community, it's hard to say whether or not he's a genuinely concerned parent or just another grifter. And when this is framed as a fight for children, it basically gives carte blanche to politicians to say or do whatever to this demographic. And as evidenced by the latest election, this messaging is effective. Right now, trans folks are in the middle of a perfect storm keeping them down. Basically, they're such a tiny group that people don't empathize with them, and they can be used as scapegoats when there are way more pressing matters at hand. So what can we do about it? The first thing to keep in mind is that these fights last a long time. It took decades of mainstream attention before same-sex marriage was legalized federally. Women couldn't even open up a bank account on their own until the 70s. In comparison, the trans rights movement is still in its infancy. And if you think about it within the context of the stage it's in, the roadblocks become a lot more clear. I predict that the transgender will be viewed more like homosexuals by the mid to late 40s. If activists are proactive. So I suggest that organizers and members look at the roots of previous civil rights groups. Studying how previous successful movements started may help inspire a new one. At the very least, the transgender community needs to be seen, which is a little ironic. Most transgendered people aren't looking to draw attention to themselves, and that makes sense. But if people choose to remain invisible, they relinquish all their political power. So going out and being seen is important. Just don't intentionally block traffic. That's not gonna win anyone over. But honestly, getting a meaningful protest started is hard when the trans population is so low. And even if you have the numbers, where they're at is equally important. Protesting in New York City or liberal California won't make an impact. So allies, you have to show up too. If you're some straight-laced person who works 9 to 5, has a family with that white picket fence, your support is more valuable than gold. Now, historically, progressive movements screen potential allies with purity tests. And there is no worse way to drum up support than purity tests. Think how many progressive movements fail to gain traction because they cannibalize themselves over petty grievances. The trans community cannot afford to fall into that same trap. Not with their numbers, no. Now, that might mean putting up with some ignorance or bigotry, but an ally is an ally. Someone willing up to take another's fight up as their own should be cherished, not chastised for saying pregnant woman instead of pregnant person. And for the more egregious acts, remember, this movement is in its infancy. A lot of people have already fell for misinformation. Enough Americans think that schools help facilitate transgender reassignment surgery that it impacted the most recent election. This is the level of shit that needs to be deprogrammed. So give people time to change. It's like when some old lady goes from calling black people to colored folks. Is it still great? Absolutely not, but it's a step in the right direction. The trans community also needs to think more politically. That often means giving up some concessions. For example, to help alleviate the fear of parents, any mention of gender-affirming care for minors should be dropped, as it gives the opposition so much ammunition.
But the transgender thing is incredible. Think of it, your kid goes to school and comes home a few days later with an operation.
Teenagers can still have preferred names or pronouns and dress however they want, but America's proved that right now, they just can't stomach anything beyond that. This may seem unfair to trans kids, but being conservative now may pay off dividends down the line. But probably the most important thing is bracing yourself. These fights are never won easily, and are never without casualties. Whether it's through finance, health, social status, the marginalized and stigmatized will always suffer. But the war for civil rights isn't waged for the current generation. It's so future people don't have to experience the same horrors.